Welcome to the Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast. I am Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. Today, we're talking about public opinion and voting attitudes in the U.S. and Mexican electorates. Joining me is Carlos Moreno Jaimes, a professor and researcher at ITESO, a Jesuit university in Guadalajara, Mexico. He was recently a Fulbright visiting professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on local government and public health policy. Recently, during his stay in Austin, Texas, he conducted a survey to explore U.S. public opinion toward Mexico and Mexican public opinion towards the United States. Thank you for listening. Carlos, if I may, tell me a little bit about this survey. What motivated you to carry out this public opinion survey, and why did you think about doing it on both sides of the border?
Hi, Tony. Thank you for having me. Well, the idea emerged while I was a Fulbright visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin in 2023. A colleague at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and I were concerned about the rising polarization in Mexico and the United States. We wondered whether polarization was likely to affect the collaboration between the two countries, between Mexico and the United States, a country that have developed strong political, economic, and cultural ties. So we conducted an online survey to master students likely to influence the public sphere in fields such as public policy, global affairs, business, and law. In the United States and Mexico, the survey is titled the Binational Policy Elite Survey. It identifies people's political beliefs and their views of the public affairs of the neighboring country. Of course, students of the Master of Global Affairs at Rice University participated in the survey, and we are very grateful to you for the help you provided to us.
Sure. Thank you, Carlos. Yeah, let me ask you about the content of the survey and the results, because I found some of the findings quite interesting. One of the most important findings, I think, has to do with polarization. It seems by the results that polarization is present on both sides of the borders. We have a polarized publics, really. How does polarization affect perception? How do you think polarization affects perception in relation to our neighbors? What are the numbers? What do they show in relation to political polarization in both the U.S. and Mexico?
Well, it affects in several ways. First of all, we asked people what they thought the leading problems in the neighboring country. And particularly in the United States, there are strong differences between the two polarized groups. We identified moderates as well as extreme Republicans and extreme Democrats. And for example, according to the Mexican sample, Mexicans think that the United States has three main problems. Number one is drug consumption. Number two is racism and discrimination. And number three is the cost of healthcare services. On the other way, Americans think that the main problem in Mexico is corruption. 45% of people think that. 22% think that the main problem in Mexico is crime and insecurity. 12% think that the problem is bad government performance. This is in general, but if you concentrate on the polarized groups, of course, extreme Republicans are more likely to think that the main problem of Mexico is corruption, while extreme Democrats tend to think that the real problem is crime and insecurity. So this is one example in which you see differences in perceptions about the problems of the other country. But we also ask people to assess the binational relationship in subjects such as security, migration, and we found interesting results. For example, in the United States, extreme Democrats are better disposed to binational collaboration and more critical of their own country regarding problems such as immigration, crime, and violence. Extreme Republicans are more critical of the binational relationship and have a more negative view of Mexico and its problems compared to other parties and groups.
And did you find similar differences among pro-López Obrador, pro-regime in Mexico, public opinion in that direction, and critics of the López Obrador administration? Are there also similar differences as you found among Democrats and Republicans in Mexico?
Yes. In Mexico, the two polarized groups are those who support Morena, Andrés Manuel López Obrador party.
For our audience, Morena is the governing political party, of course, in Mexico.
Exactly.
López Obrador's political party. Mm-hmm.
Right. And the other extreme are those who oppose to Morena. Those are the two polarized groups. And we found that in Mexico, the extreme supporters of Andrés Manuel López Obrador party have the most nationalist foreign policy preferences, while their political rivals are more prone to the United States. An interesting finding, I was very surprised by this result, is that the binational relationship is twice as divisive for Americans than for Mexicans. So the binational relationship is divisive in both countries, but in America, it is twice compared to Mexicans. So this was shocking for us.
Do you mean that the negative perceptions of Mexico in the United States are greater than the negative perception of Mexicans towards the United States in general?
Exactly.
But it makes a difference whether you're pro-government or anti-government in Mexico.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, this is kind of concerning because I think there's a lot of misinformation among the public opinion as well. I mean, I know that the pro-López Obrador and pro-Morena folks in Mexico, obviously with a more nationalistic bent, may also have a misunderstanding of the interdependence between the two countries. Did you explore any actual or factual knowledge about the interdependence between the two countries, for example, on trade?
What we did explore is the information, the degree of knowledge that each country has about the other country. And there are interesting results because in general, we found that many people in the United States report knowing virtually anything about Mexico. So when we asked, for example, if you have the opportunity to vote in Mexico, which party would you choose? And around 70% of Americans say, I don't know. So this is one indicator of the little knowledge that Americans have about Mexico. In contrast, Mexicans know more about the United States.
It's sort of a complex interdependence where one particular group, Mexican citizens, are forced to know more about the United States. And I think that sort of reflects the importance of the U.S. to Mexico as opposed to the importance of Mexico to the United States. Would that be a good conclusion?
Yes, that would be one of the main conclusions. Yeah, this study somehow resembles what we suspect about the binational relationship, but there are some interesting results, those that I have mentioned to you.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question before we move on to some of the specific items that you interviewed or these elite students in universities, which in my view should be expected to know more about each other because they are more highly educated individuals. And so some of the results, especially when it comes to knowledge of each other, are surprising. But let me say something about polarization or ask you about that. Do you think that polarization in both countries, which is kind of higher than at other times, is something that politicians create, fabricate, and fuel and maintain? Or is polarization something that our politicians on both sides of the border are simply riding on and using for their own political purposes? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the politicians creating the polarization and therefore influencing public opinion through polarization, as you found? Or is it really polarization as a political phenomenon that politicians, opportunistic politicians, whether it be Trump or López Obrador in Mexico, are simply using to their advantage?
Well, this is a very complex question, but I tend to suspect that politicians take advantage of pre-existing divisions, social divisions, and they put a name, they put a label on those divisions, and they create a narrative in order to polarize people against. Trump's previous presidential campaign was very clear in that sense. Mexico was a very good excuse for dividing the American society. And I think that campaign was effective. Our results show that that campaign might be very effective in dividing the two polarized groups according to their views of Mexico. And I would say that López Obrador did the same. But in the case of Mexico, I don't think that the United States was an issue of this polarized narrative in the case of López Obrador. López Obrador created polarization more regarding domestic issues, but not the United States.
Oh, that's an interesting finding. In the United States, Mexico is front and center with all the issues that it brings with it, immigration, fentanyl, and so on, for the political class, as opposed to Mexico, where the enemies are really fabricated within Mexico. They're really created among the elites. It's a more populist, a different kind of populism, I would say, because I think both leaders are somewhat populist, but they obviously create enemies in different levels in the binational relationship. Let me ask you, there's a couple of things that I found surprising in the results: security and migration. What do they think? What are the numbers? And who thinks what exactly when it comes to security and migration in either side or on either side of the border?
Okay. Just let me give you some examples. When asked, should the United States legalize the consumption of illegal drugs? This is a very divisive issue, both in Mexico and the United States, but particularly in the United States. For example, almost 80% of extreme Republicans strongly oppose to that measure, while almost 60% of extreme Democrats support the legalization of some illegal drugs. So this is one example. Another divisive issue in the United States has to do with Mexico should strengthen border security to protect United States citizens. That statement is very divisive, both in Mexico and in the United States. Extreme Republicans are the group that tends to favor that policy measure, while extreme Democrats strongly oppose that policy. There is an interesting statement. The statement is the United States is responsible for preventing U.S.-made weapons from being sold to criminal organizations in Mexico. Interestingly, both Democrats and Republicans coincide that the U.S. is partially responsible for that. So this is maybe the only policy statement where we found some convergence between the two political groups in the United States. This is a positive finding.
Yeah, it would seem to me that public opinion in Mexico would fall on the same side. Did you ask the question about illegal weapons smuggling into Mexico in Mexico for pro-government and anti-government public opinion?
Right. We pose exactly the same questions in Mexico and the United States. And of course, there are also differences in Mexico. In this case, those supporters of Morena are more likely to support that statement that the U.S. is responsible for preventing weapons from being sold to criminal organizations in Mexico.
Right. So what about immigration? I mean, you ask questions about immigration. Obviously, I would expect quite a divergence of opinion.
For example, we asked whether the United States should give foreign people the opportunity to migrate legally to reduce worker shortages in the United States. And in Mexico, both pro-Morena and anti-Morena coincide in that possibility. But this is highly divisive in the United States. Only extreme Democrats support that policy measure, but extreme Republicans strongly oppose to that measure. Another question would be whether undocumented immigrants living in the United States should be deported. Again, only extreme Republicans support that measure. And in Mexico, that possibility is supported by anti-Morena. So you see differences across many issues.
But the issues are the same, right? I mean, when it comes to the binational relationship, you got the economic integration, trade, and such things. You got immigration, you got weapons, you got drugs. I mean, these are the same issues that have shown up in survey after survey in the binational relationship for the last 30, 40 years. So not much has changed. Maybe the public opinion and the survey shows nuances, but at the end of the day, the issues that both countries have to deal with appear to be the same.
Yeah, I agree.
So let me ask you, do you think the two countries, according to your survey, are diverging or converging today? I know that in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, the two countries seemed to move in the same direction. The NAFTA agreement was, I think, the crowning jewel of that particular convergence. But today, there seems to be a lot more divergence between the two countries. Is that a good assessment?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is.
What would you suggest that politicians have to do to reverse that divergence? Because they have the ability to influence public opinion. Public opinion is a more interactive phenomenon. It's not just a matter of spontaneous generation in the public. Politicians also structure it, give it sense, and label it, as you said.
First of all, they should not use the binational relationship to divide society. They should stop doing that because in the end, we are all affected. Our view of the neighboring country is very important for everyone. We share 2,000 miles of border. We have developed cultural, economic, political ties, and this is not going to disappear. Polarization is not going to change that reality. So politicians should stop dividing society through their storytelling.
So those are some of the public policy implications of your study. Are there any other public policy implications that you think we should consider as both societies experience a period of great polarization, extreme Republicans and Democrats in the United States, with a sliver in the middle, independent thinkers, and then, of course, in Mexico, also extreme polarization between those who support the government and those who are very much against the government? What are the serious policy implications? Is there the possibility of a binational framework for cooperation given the polarization in both countries?
Well, yes, I think we should take advantage of the fact that there are issues where polarized groups agree. And I just gave you the example of selling weapons to criminal groups. Democrats and Republicans agree that their country is partially responsible for the problem of criminal violence in Mexico. And this, in my view, opens the opportunity for a new collaboration agreement in which weapon control should be a priority. That would be one positive implication. Another one could be that the advocates of binational collaboration should frame their communication strategies in a way that resonates with the preferences of divergent political groups, particularly extreme Republicans. Again, the neighborhood between the two countries will remain, as will the issues of common interest. So it's better to think about ways to depolarize the binational relationship.
Yeah, I know we've covered your survey in 20 minutes. It's been a very brief conversation, but there's already some important points that we should think about. So where can we find the results of your survey? Are they going to be published in a particular place that our audience can go and kind of peek into them?
We are going to have a web page where we are going to post the questionnaire, the data set, and we are going to post policy briefs, papers derived from this project.
Well, Carlos, I thank you for sharing your preliminary results. I'm sure you are sifting through the data and trying to make sense of it, and some good papers will come out of it. Thank you so much for listening to us. The Judah A. Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions, and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of actions. Special thanks to Judah A. Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the center, and to Lisa Wakita, our program manager. Thank you.